G'day YouTube, Warbles on a lot here. Even though this is a hologram of a painting of the Battle of Trafalgar, we're going to talk about security in the South China Sea. And yes, it's a radio documentary.
The theme of security runs through the program, albeit two very different security issues. Later, the story of WikiLeaks, as portrayed in the new documentary feature film We Steal Secrets. It analyses Julian Assange, who he is, what he stands for, and his controversial website, which facilitated the largest security breach in US history. But before that, we ask, is there an arms race going on in the South China Sea? Growing antagonism over territorial and exclusive economic zone claims in the South China Sea, along with an increasingly assertive Chinese military presence in the region, has impelled many countries in the region to begin expanding their militaries, particularly their naval capacity, such as submarines and large surface combatants. But does this amount to an arms race? Richard Bitzinger argues this rearming contributes to a classic security dilemma and could be potentially destabilising to regional security. Richard A. Bitzinger is a senior fellow with the Military Transformations Program at the S. Rajaratnam School of International Studies in Singapore, where his work focuses on security and defence issues relating to the Asia-Pacific region. He's talking here at the Griffith Asia Institute.
I see basically four really most powerful drivers, at the factors that are sort of promoting, pushing military modernization, naval modernization in this case, and two enablers. I mean, the interesting thing about Southeast Asia is even though all the countries in the region belong to ASEAN, and ASEAN is, of course, I suppose the most facetious way to refer to it is a kumbaya type of organization which promotes regional cooperation, peaceful development, non-interference. Everybody's basically, good friends with each other. There are some residual under the surface types of animosities and even some territorial claims that are conflicting with each other. And these do affect relationships at a very kind of subcutaneous level in a way. I mean, there are still unresolved territorial claims, particularly in the Spratlys and some of these small island areas. Also between Thailand and Malaysia, there are some along the border there's some kind of not really going to war, but definitely unresolved border issues. In particular, what we have seen in the last 10, 15 years is the emergence of overlapping and very strongly made claims over exclusive economic zones, EEZs, particularly in the South China Sea, because of either known or estimated oil and gas deposits that may or may not exist in large parts of these EEZs, and above all, just currently is just simply conflicts over fisheries. And the South China Sea is a major fishing breadbasket, and of course there's a lot of concern about not only overfishing but poaching. And so you see a huge overlap. And then finally, just certain intra-ASEAN contentions, I don't want to say animosities, but there's a certain historical kind of ill feelings or concerns or suspicions. Singapore versus Malaysia, Myanmar versus Thailand, Thailand versus Cambodia. And, these are the kinds of issues that some people think could influence arms acquisition. A lot of regional militaries are shifting away from their traditional roles and missions, which tended to be very internally directed. A lot of them sort of geared towards counterinsurgencies within their own territories, or kind of territorial defense, mostly along land borders, or in some cases simply that the militaries existed to oppress their own people and to enforce military dictatorships. But this has been changing, and in fact you're finding growing kind of external requirements. In particular, this requirement to protect sea lanes of communications, or SLOCs. The South China Sea and the region around Southeast Asia is very critical to global trade. And in fact, you could argue that this region actually constitutes like the world's largest type of canal. I mean, certainly the amount of traffic that passes through the Southeast Asian waterways is much bigger than ever goes through the Panama or the Suez Canal. So it's a very important slot. At the same time, a lot of regional militaries finding increased requirements for things like peacekeeping operations, humanitarian assistance, disaster relief, various stabilization missions such as we saw in like East Timor, particularly after the 2004 tsunami that hit Indonesia and Thailand. There's this feeling that militaries have very important HADR missions that they should be taking on. And then finally, just the idea of the contributing to, good order at sea, protecting the global commons, fighting terrorism, fighting piracy, fighting transnational crime that may take place in their waterways. And there's a certain, it's not just altruistic. There's a certain self-serving nature to it, because the Southeast Asian nations know that if they can't guarantee good order at sea in their regional waters, other countries like the United States or China or Japan will do it for them. And they're trying to avoid that situation. Obviously, one of the things that's become a real situation in the last, particularly in the last 5 years, is the growing Chinese presence in Southeast Asia, particularly the South China Sea, and particularly an increasingly more assertive or even aggressive China in this area. Now, China, of course, has considerable economic interest that involves Southeast Asia, and particularly it's a very important waterway for them, and as it puts here, 80% of their oil imports come through these Southeast Asian slots. And in a sense, too, what they also see is their claims over the South China Sea have become increasingly intransigent. Recently, they have announced things like they have sovereign control. That 9-dash line, which used to be put up as a so-called starting point for negotiations, has, in many conversations that I've had, increasingly become an issue of intransigence. That is not just simply a goal. That is actually what our claim is. Now, that's not officially made, but it is becoming increasingly something that you find a lot of digging it of heels when it comes to that. And this issue, of course, that the South China Sea is now a core issue, a core interest for them. And that makes it a lot hard in order to try and deal with the way that they approach these types of negotiations over South China Sea sovereignty. And correspondingly, we've seen a pretty significant military buildup by the Chinese around Southeast Asia. We've seen the PLA Navy in its efforts to basically move from being what was largely a brown water, coastal-oriented type of Navy to one that they would like. I'm not saying it is, but I think their goal is to become a modern blue water Navy, an open ocean Navy capable of sustainable power projection and expeditionary capabilities. And we've seen the expansion or the creation of new bases in Southeast Asia, and particularly a buildup in the Spratly Islands. Now, sort of underwriting all this, of course, is a continuing increase in Chinese defense spending. If you go back to the late 1990s, you see that Chinese defense spending, even after taking inflation into account, has gone up on average around 10% a year. And the cumulative effect basically has been that defense spending has probably gone up at least fivefold. In 1997, they were spending roughly around $7 billion US dollars. This year, they're talking about close to 120 billion US dollars, making them the second largest defense spender in the world, overtaking countries like Japan and the UK in recent years. The other side of this is the fact that their budget for equipment, which is about 1/3 of their overall budget, has similarly gone up. And again, it means that the Chinese simply have a lot more money that they can put into their military in order to modernize it. Now, what we've seen, of course, is certain bases that they have, particularly on Hainan Island, where they've expanded their naval facilities there and adding some of their most up-to-date and modern equipment that they've had, in particular these new types of destroyers and their best maritime strike aircraft. On this woody island, which is in the middle of the South China Sea, they've added a longer runway and have often cycled some of their most advanced fighters to operate temporarily out of that area. In particular, this is where they're keeping a lot of their most modern nuclear-powered submarines, is on Hainan Island. And then you see some of these small islands that they have where they, I always find this interesting, the way they've turned these things into the runways are actually bigger than the island these days. And of course, you put fuel depots there and everything, and it makes them very good forward operating bases. The Spratly Island buildup is one of the more interesting ones, operating under the presumption that, possession is 9/10 of the law. Something that the Chinese have been doing is when they lay claim to one of these so-called Spratly Islands, which oftentimes are no more than rocky outlets that just barely pop above the surface. Generally what they've done is they've assembled at first these very crude bases. They build a platform, they put a couple of buildings there, they pluck a couple of poor slobs out of the PLA, give them 6 months worth of rations and a big flag to fly if anybody comes by, to basically assert sovereignty. Then over the years they've actually expanded these bases, basically poured a lot of concrete over them. After a while, the artificial manufactured structure totally obliterates the little islets that you see, and they've become more and more permanent in a way. And this is something that they've done in many cases. Now, I'm not saying they're the only ones who have done it too, but they've certainly been very good at establishing their footholds in the Spratlys. The United States military has also sort of added a little extra fuel to the fire of what's going on in Southeast Asia. Their so-called pivot back to Asia, which is really a pivot to Southeast Asia, because they are also sort of drawing down certain troop numbers out of South Korea and Japan. They've been, trying to build up their forces in Guam as a corresponding measure. But in particular, what you're seeing is new basing and alliance arrangements that are really involved in this part of the world in Southeast Asia. The U.S. Navy is going to be moving some new so-called LCS, littoral combat ships, to Singapore. They'll be based there on a cycling basis. And of course, as a lot of people here know, U.S. Marines are going to be deployed to northern Australia, again on a kind of a rotational basis. And in general, just simply the effort of the United States military to increase its interoperability with forces in Japan, Australia, Singapore, etc. So you see, this is an area where a lot of outside large powers are starting to become much more kind of interested in what's going on, and that's raising a lot of the stakes. Now, when we turn to the responses, that is, what is the Southeast Asian countries doing? There's these two enablers that I think we have to keep in mind when we look at the last 15-odd years of arms procurement. And the first is, essentially, these countries have got a lot more money than they used to be able to devote to arms acquisition. There has been a pretty steady and significant increase in defense spending amongst most of the leading Southeast Asian countries. Indonesia, Malaysia, Singapore, Thailand, Vietnam. And I would dare say if you could get the data for 2013, you would probably find even more significant increases, particularly on the part of Indonesia, which I think is probably overtaken Singapore now as the largest biggest defense spender in Southeast Asia. Overall, during the last decade, military spending in Southeast Asia rose on average about 50% in real terms. So there just simply is more money available. And the other side is there's simply more product out there that is available for these countries to buy. And this is largely the byproduct of the end of the Cold War and how it affected the leading arms-producing countries, particularly in Western Europe, Russia, Israel, but even the United States. You had a lot of countries in the West and in Russia which, during the Cold War, put considerable resources into building up their military-industrial complexes in order to basically, arm for the Cold War. And when that ended, Therefore, a lot of countries were left with a lot of excess production capabilities. And they faced a lot of layoffs and consolidation and rationalization. Some of that was undertaken. But one of the things that became more important to these countries was the export market. And so what you found is more and more certain arms-producing firms and certain arms-producing countries became overwhelmingly dependent upon arms exports. That is, their foreign markets. And so, for example, countries like Israel, which basically export about 75% of their defense product, or companies like BAE Systems or Thales, which will also probably do much more than half of their business outside of their home countries of, say, the UK or France. Even in the United States, which has a large internal domestic defense market and still does, you find large companies like Lockheed or Boeing still pursuing arms exports because it's one of the things that keeps a lot of assembly lines open. Like, for example, the F-16, which hasn't been delivered to the U.S. Air Force in more than a decade, and production is entirely based on export orders. So when you have this overwhelming dependency on exports, basically what you create is a very competitive buyer's market. And most of these suppliers are really willing to deal, to wheel and deal, when it comes to trying to gain orders. No order is too small. No interesting financing deal is ever going to be passed up. And how that affects Southeast Asia, I think, is very interesting. Now, like I say, Southeast Asia is a small market overall, but it is a growing market. And as we can see, again, from SIPRI data, countries like Malaysia, Singapore, and Indonesia have really increased their arms imports over the last decade or so. In fact, Singapore actually has the dubious distinction of being the 5th largest arms importer in recent years. So there's stuff that's available. The other thing that I think is interesting about Southeast Asia is that it's one of the few truly open arms markets. A lot of countries tend to have preferred suppliers. You know, Japan mostly buys from the United States. India mostly buys from Russia. But in Southeast Asia, it is very open. And you see this when you look at the types of procurements. The Russians have been able to sell fighter jets to a large number of countries: Indonesia, Malaysia, Vietnam. Sweden has been able to sell fighter jets and submarines. You know, Britain and France have also had pretty good toeholds in there. And so it's a very competitive market. And the more competition, obviously, the more that you can get good deals when it comes to price or how you pay for these.
Here endeth part 1 of Big Ideas.